Welcome to the All Time Stories channel. Today's episode features the 10 most terrible tortures of the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, torture of humans turned into a real art, in which each executioner-inventor tried to outdo everyone else with the cruelty of his imagination. The inhuman ruthless methods of medieval executors allowed them to knock out any information from the unfortunate victim and literally break the bravest and most persistent of people. In this issue we will get acquainted with the most terrifying trials of that time. Waterboarding is one of the most famous and classic tortures, invented by the Spanish Inquisition. A tube was inserted into the victim's throat, through which water was continuously poured until it began to splash out through the mouth. Then the inquisitors beat the unfortunate man's swollen belly, forcing him to spew out streams of water in order to repeat the whole procedure again. This torture was considered one of the most harmless, and the testimony that was extracted from it was equated to a voluntary confession. Waterboarding was most often used against heretics and witches. The Brazen Bull is another example of a classic torture technique that originated in ancient Greece but survived into the Middle Ages. The principle of this torture is quite simple. A naked person was placed inside a copper structure, originally a statue of a bull, but later the bull was replaced with ordinary tanks. A fire was lit under the structure, heating its walls to the limit. The person inside was forced to constantly receive burns, since his body was in close contact with the hot metal and suffocate from lack of air. Most often, the fear of being roasted alive in a cramped container forced the victim to give all the necessary testimony almost immediately, but sometimes the Brazen Bull was also used as an execution weapon. The Spanish boot was one of the most popular instruments of the Spanish Inquisition. It was a metal boot into which the victim's foot was placed. Then, with the help of special screws, the boot plates were gradually compressed to such an extent that they crushed all the bones on the victim's leg. After such torture, the man's leg resembled a shapeless leather stocking, in which fragments of bones dangled randomly. The torture was not fatal, but after it the person remained disabled forever. The rack, like the Spanish boot, was a very popular method of torture and relatively bloodless. The victim was tied with ropes by the arms and legs to a special bed with an ingenious mechanism. The executioner then set the mechanism in motion, tightening the ropes to such an extent that the muscles and tendons on the victim's limbs began to tear, and the bones popped out of their joints. The rack did not kill a person, but turned him helpless, a disabled person who was bedridden for the rest of his life. The rack received special recognition on the territory of the Russian kingdom. Due to its obvious cruelty, the Iron Maiden is considered by many historians to be a hoax that was not used in reality, but the design of this instrument itself is truly terrifying. The Iron Maiden was a sarcophagus covered on the inside with metal spikes. The unfortunate person was pushed inside such a sarcophagus and the lid was closed, literally pressing the victim's body into the spikes surrounding it. The person's body immediately found itself pierced by hundreds of sharp stakes, causing monstrous pain. The length of the spikes was such as not to kill a person, but only to mutilate him. This often resulted in loss of teeth, vision or hearing. There were also special holes in the Iron Maiden, allowing if desired to insert daggers and rapiers into it in the manner of circus magicians. They were also positioned with the expectation not to kill, but to cause maximum suffering to the victim. Imagine that there are hungry rats swarming inside you, devouring you alive. Rats torture was invented in China and happily adopted by Europeans. Cages with hungry rats that had no bottom were placed on the victim's body, and the top of this cage was covered with hot coals, forcing the rats inside to rush around in search of salvation. They were surrounded on all sides by a metal plate, so the rats had no choice but to gnaw passages through the unfortunate man's flesh. Typically such cells were placed on the stomach, into which the rats penetrated. The iron pear, or otherwise called the suffering pear. This device was the highest manifestation of sadism, due to the phallic symbolism of the instrument. It was usually used to punish women and homosexuals. The operating principle was as follows. The bulb was inserted into the anus or vagina, and then the executioner activated the mechanism and opened metal petals from inside, tearing the flesh and causing profuse bleeding. To increase painful sensations, the suffering bulb was often rotated. More often than not, the procedure was fatal. The Judas Cradle is another torture invented in the dungeons of the Spanish Inquisition. A person was seated on the top of a small but sharp pyramid. The top of this pyramid was thrust into the anus or vagina of the victim, gradually going deeper and deeper. Accordingly, as the pyramid expanded towards the bottom, the affected area became larger with every second, as the victim became more and more impaled on the pyramid. Often a person was kept on this device for several days until he died from blood loss or rupture of internal organs. In essence, this torture was reminiscent of burning, but much more cruel and sophisticated. Wheeling was considered the most painful of tortures and always ended with the death of the victim. The condemned man had almost all the bones of his body broken, turning him into a terrible resemblance to a rag doll, then torn by terrible pain and unable to move. The unfortunate man was tied to a large wheel and lifted onto a pole. In this form with broken bones, the man hung under the scorching sun for long hours. His body was pecked by flocks of birds until he died of pain or dehydration. However, most victims preferred to die a quick death in exchange for all the necessary testimony. And finally, one of the most horrific tortures, which can rather be considered execution. The blood eagle was used by the ancient Vikings as a punishment for Christians. The victim's flesh was cut along the spine and then they broke out ribs like bone wings. To make it more effective, salt was often poured directly onto the victim's exposed spine. The pain that the unfortunate man experienced forced him to give up any secrets in exchange for a quick death, which took place through ripping out his lungs, although death came quickly in any case, because no person could withstand such torment. Thank you very much for watching. Subscribe to the channel, leave your thoughts in the comments and give it a thumbs up. See you soon, friends.